Start the recording? No. Okay, the recording started now. So we're live on Facebook. Did you start the recording? Oh, no. Somebody turn off their microphone.
That was me.
Okay. Okay. I'm Bill Lavender with the New Orleans Poetry Festival. Thanks for coming to this event tonight. I want to thank our sponsors, the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation and the Academy of American Poets, who generously contributed to make this one happen this year and keep it free and open to all. And so we're here to for a roundtable on poetry and ecology. And I'm just going to turn it over to James Sherry, who will moderate and introduce the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Bill. Really appreciate the opportunity to bring this panel to you all. And I'm going to introduce the panelists and give a brief introduction of the situation as we find it today. Emissions of greenhouse gases from 6 industries: transportation, energy, manufacturing, construction, mining, and agriculture, produce global warming. The incentive for corporations to reduce these emissions will not easily emerge from the current torrent of capital expansion, models of nature as too large and perfect to be affected by mere mortals, consumer narcissism, and competitive self-interest as the optimum principle of interaction in society. And inequality too must be addressed at several levels to help people avoid habitat and institutional destruction in an effort to feed their families and their nations. The distortions of finance have intruded into all human activity. Cultural institutions are built as tax havens. Even the Poetry Foundation is headed by an ex-fund manager. Actually, I think that's changed since I wrote this. Humanity as a species is not making the required changes to industrial practices that threaten to destroy the livability of the planet for our species. Unrestricted development and private capital are attacking the climate. In order to reduce the threats of natural disaster, plague, and privation, industry has built a monster. Until and unless we include our surroundings and ourselves together in our calculations about the good, the necessary, and the desired ends of civilization, we will continue to destroy the ability of the planet to support our own and many other species. This is a language problem in that development is not sufficiently regulated by governments. Creativity is not sufficiently interrogated by poets. Desire is not sufficiently questioned by individuals. Most people will not change how they think about and treat their surroundings without significant pressure being placed on their cultural biases, by which I mean the language that they use, their self-image and group identification, such as family and community, and assumptions about the availability of resources needed to secure their safety and freedom to pursue self-interest. 3 major differing tendencies among current global warming solutions operate simultaneously. First, groups preserving resources from development, the parks and people contingent, that continues to misrepresent humanity and nature as separate entities. The new conservation crowd that addresses nature as capital encourages the re-engineering of habitat for financial expansion, including capitalism's assumption that nature remains a force to be overcome. And third, the progressive notion that human ingenuity can stop expansion reiterates the Soviet era error about the incentives that humans and actually all life need to thrive. Appeals by science to rationality have only convinced some people and appear insufficient by themselves to force wholesale policy change in the time we have left to avoid societal collapse. Each of these points of view has important uses and abuses. Language and language construction, the stuff and process of poetry, must also change to accommodate new relations with our surroundings, getting beyond the pastoral without losing appreciation for it. Today, we will hear from 6 panelists about alternative views of our relationship to our surroundings, viewed through the lenses of poetry. Poetry raises awareness about language and consequently how people conceptualize and act on climate change. Poetry informs pop culture, and a lot of pop culture is poetry. Poetry speaks to beauty, yet does not glue its gaze. The narrow distribution of poetry should not delude us into thinking that poetry does not affect the larger culture. Our panelists today will speak in the following order. Saba Razvi will speak about how climate change reestablishes the connections between the human individual and our habitats. Then Evelyn Reilly will read a hybrid talk poem that explores the we of the Anthropocene. Kit Robinson shows how poetry can stimulate resistance to capitalist notions of continental expansion by emphasizing difference. Charles Alexander agrees with Kit in his examination of 2 quite different models for revising our senses of how nature works without us. Elizabeth Gross addresses ecological catastrophe and non-human perspectives through interdisciplinary collaboration. And lastly, Brenda Iijima's new title, Bionic Communality, is just out from Roof Books, and she will address the fraught category of the human. Then we will have some discussions and answer any questions. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll monitor those questions. So now, please, Saba, will you start the program?
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. I'm just going to pull up my screen share. If you'll give me just a second to do that. I tested it, so it ought to be working, but I think it took a moment to appear last time. So, can you guys all see a slide? Awesome. I need to... Can you hear me? Okay. Climate change, ecological disaster, environmental degradation, and a sense of impending doom surrounding the human relationship to these larger-than-life issues make themselves present in everything from marketing campaigns to advertisements about the latest new blockbuster movie, and recently come to mind when we sit in lockdown in the midst of a pandemic. Unlike many passing fads in conversation or in media or in the arts, our relationship to issues of the environment are vital to our lived experiences in the world. Poetry doesn't let humans off the hook with these issues, even if the sense of scope far exceeds the potential of individual impact. Instead, it asks readers to engage with these issues in particularly personal, particularly intimate ways, demanding their individual involvement by way of considering individual experience. Consider these lines from the Poetic Edda on the topic of Ragnarok, which we might consider the end of human connection to the environment, as translated by Andreas Sneer Magnuson, who I'm going to talk about shortly because I think he's adapted some ecofeminist poetic language in his discourse that I find valuable. The sun goes dark, the lands sink, the shining stars disappear from the skies, the great ash will burn and fierce heat will lick the skies. You can't hear those lines without putting yourself there, witnessing with intensity the consequences of events that matter to us intimately. Andreas Sneer Magnuson is an Icelandic writer. He was asked to write a eulogy of the first glacier to lose its status as a glacier in Iceland. He wrote in response to the melting and death of Ökjökull. Oak is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all of our glaciers are expected to follow the same path, and this monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening, what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. There are many examples of how ecofeminist poetry and the occult can change the structures of thought under our language, even without the idea of poetry or feminist discourse as the center of the conversation. I think that Magnuson's work does a really nice job of inheriting these principles and utilizing them. So I want to talk a little bit about how he presents these ideas in his particular book on time and on water, and then move on to discuss how these principles and notions in contemporary movements in poetry are sort of doing these kinds of things. In his new book on time and water, He writes that words like glacial melt, record heat, ocean acidification, increasing emissions are much more serious than anything that's happened in human history up until now, but that people don't really get it. They don't see it right away because it's too abstract for them. His analysis of our relationship to the natural world implies that part of the problem is a connection to the language of resources and economics in particular. These abstract topics disconnect us from the personal, focusing instead on abstract and distant topics. An antidote to that could be an aspect of the lyrical, particularly the aspect of the lyrical that invokes occult practices, ideas of vision, and visionary concepts. Magnuson suggests that despite all warnings, people do not yet fully grasp the ramifications of a hotter planet because the language of climate crisis is still too new, too filled with jargon, too tainted by an obsession with economic growth. He also tells us that he thinks Earth's mightiest forces have forsaken geological time and now change on a human scale. So stuff that previously took on, maybe hundreds of thousands of years to happen are going to happen very quickly within maybe 100 years. That speed is mythological. It affects all life on Earth, the roots of everything we think, choose, produce, and believe. It affects everyone we know, everyone we love. These changes surpass any of our previous experiences, surpass most of the language and metaphors we use to navigate our reality. And then he expands to say that often in the minds of people, climate change is just white noise, because while we understand loss, we can't understand the scale in the same way. When it comes to the infinite large, the sacred, to the things that are fundamental to our lives, there's no comparable reaction. The brain doesn't recognize the scale. And so the language obviously needs to change. In order to make an impact in writing about it, utilizing mythological language allows people to connect to something of a mythological scale, which is something that poetry can help us do. Those words from the Poetic Edda that I quoted just a little while ago remind us of just this. And they give us a hint into the divide between the problem that affects us personally and intimately, but that we don't talk about or conceptualize in an intimate or personal manner. Looking into ecofeminist language helps us move beyond that particular barrier. It's no surprise that we are kind of having a moment of the witch right now, and we have a lot of the sense of self-empowerment connected to this particular discourse. These are just a few images of things that come up if I search for these particular concepts, presented just to give you a sense of this particular trend, this particular social trend. We see another relationship between the ancient world and the new, the mythological and the scientific, that have collided to the present to make a connection that we find expressing itself in poetry. Eco-literature takes on many forms, but one way in which it engages feminist literary explorations is specifically through the ideas of myth punk, which is something I want to focus on. In poetry, that myth punk element is often tied to individual empowerment of women through connection with nature and specifically the occult. And we might think back to the ancient Nordic seers and practitioners of Seder, the vulva, who are making a comeback, channeling their warnings about the world through poetry and inviting us to think about our connection with the environment in language that is feminine and feminist, but that doesn't depend upon patriarchal conquest or consumption. After all, the seer was generally a woman capable of extending her language capacity with that of nature. This does not exclude our concepts of non-binary and of gender, but I want to focus on the feminist aspects of it that are rooted in the concept of the vulva. Capable of extending her capacity with that of nature, the ability to channel spirits of nature by projecting her spirit outward into another being. The poetry that we see today gaining in popularity attempts to do very similar things like that. It attempts to connect to the environment in a way that isn't necessarily looking at active social change in mechanized language or terms, but more connecting to voices and experiences that involve the environment. And they demand a personal investment in a world that is the only way through which we can resolve both personal agency and a connection to the environment that empowers that particular agency. The field of poetry and science addresses these notions head on, but a romantic trend in this contemporary poetry takes up the issues more indirectly, though just as potently. One of the ways in which we see this demand for the personal to engage with the troubles of the Anthropocene is through the trend of occult, esoteric, and spiritual approaches to nature and power. We can see that in the trend of workshops that have come up recently, workshops that talk specifically about utilizing the occult to get in touch with a sense of the self. There's is a sense that something transcendent or magical makes presence a little bit more intense and more personal, and can offer an opportunity to access individual power. In poetry, this connects notions of nature and environment to environmental disaster as well. We can think about the notion of environmental disaster through the lens of particular trauma. And I'm just about done here, but by reaching out to a different readership, the sensual details drawn from the environment narrow our focus to a space that seems manageable in scope, only to demand that our appreciation yield a commitment to concern and care beyond that narrow focus. What I'm getting at is that simple language change resulting from these trends can help spread an awareness of issues surrounding environment, responsibility, sustainability, and possibility, counteracting the powerlessness that is often felt when contending with such a large-scale problem. Industries are damaging the environment, simply humanizing the effects of climate change and environmental degradation by invoking failures of policy are not always necessarily enough. We have to engage the immediacy of the ego and the immediacy of the individual through esoteric, occult, and metaphysical conversations in order to posit itself against these processes of patriarchy, toxicity, and unrestrained industry. This poetry asks us to rethink our relationship to language with which we engage when seeking reform or even outreach, making its readers feel culpable in addressing these particular issues. I want to just leave with this moment that ecofeminism is the recognition that the destruction of our environment is paralleled by violence against and the oppression of women, that the language of poetry can remind us of personal responsibility to sort of bridge that gap. In conversation, if anyone is curious, these are some of the poems that I looked at, some of the books that I looked at to build this conversation. And I look forward to answering any questions maybe you might have. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'm Saba. That was terrific. And actually, what's interesting to me is there's certain parts of it that I think maybe I'm coming at from a different direction. So we'll see. We'll see. So I'm going to try to just briefly share my screen. And if I don't succeed, it's not really integral to what I'm doing. So let's see. Yeah, can you guys see an image there?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, I'm just gonna leave it there just for a few minutes. I had 3 working titles for what I'm about to read. The first was, but who we, which is a question that Derrida posed at the end of his essay called The Ends of Man, and which Sylvia Wynter, who some of you probably have been reading, really took up in her book, Being Human as Praxis. My second working title was called Out of Mini Hum, which in some ways is a restatement maybe of that question. But then lately, I've just been calling this the meanders, partly in honor of the Mississippi, where we were supposed to be meeting each other. And this is one of the Fisk maps. They're historical maps of the former routes of canals of the Mississippi River. This is obviously just one section of the river, but each color represents a different channel dating back to 1,000 years. And so anyway, in honor of our not being together in a specific place, I just wanted to share that. I'm gonna, okay, so maybe we'll call this the meanders. Can you all hear me? Good. So I was planning to speak of belongings and separations, congregations and negations among the many we's of people, species, and places, to carry out an interrogation through juxtaposition as a map folded brings together different locations into not proximity, but temporary alteration, a way of seeing what happens before refolding in a new iteration, which elicits perhaps new participations, while all the while the blind spots remain all over the map. In this talk, poem, or act of borrowing a figure of folding, partly from Simone White, who, regarding the Black radical aesthetic tradition, writes that the mechanics of the fold refers to the question of the manner in which relations back to other thinkers is practiced and acted upon by any artist or critic. As she herself was folding in Baraka at the same time as I was reading Sylvia Wynter, who was folding in James as in William, in a nod to the American pragmatist tradition embraced by figures as supposedly disparate as W.E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke, the latter having written, "The beauty of the formulation, meaning pragmatism, is that neither human sameness nor difference is made to seem essential," which still seems useful, so I'm folding it in as part of seeking some hybrid position between the discursive and the poetic, in spite of those who like nothing more than to say, that's not a poem, to which I answer, well, for me, it's a poem of gratitude. For I've been lately thinking that all poems are poems of gratitude in that they engage in folded intergenerational experiments, such as, for example, those enacted by Simone White in Dear Angel of Death, or Jed Razula in This Compost, experiments that might be useful, especially in the current flow of which I'm trying to trace the meanders, yes, like a river, which, like a poem, is both material embodiment and energetics of connection, a place to try to locate an effective affective position, which might be a way of stating a pragmatist solution, having to feel our way forward and test the conditions of a new meander that might even lead to a change in course. So we can't live this way anymore. But who we, someone in my imaginary audience asks, exactly chimes in a second in a tone of impatience, a plural construction not to be trusted, especially in a location of so many sedimentations and perpetrations, which has me folding in Raymond Williams. In this period of change, it mattered very much where you were looking from. And Wynter again, we must move beyond a uniquely secular liberal conception of the human, which she names Homo economicus, and then notes, there are so many people on the planet who are not part of this. Who in your family gardens, I asked the man talking about beauty and summer and hillsides, the gardener. Oh, I said. Who makes your clothes, my imaginary questioner chimes in. The invisible hand of the market, says the accountant. The forces of neoliberalism, says the pundit. Or let's just say more clearly, the hands of the poor halfway around the world. These socks, this phone, these barges of garbage, while the drilling platforms in the river are still lit up like giant luminescent insects, thus proving the persistence of beauty among our compound extremities, the floods, fires, plagues, and related social calamities, all that inundates that ancient project of human freedom. These things takes time, some say, just another generation or so. And the losers are, the envelope, please. How many times can we watch this? Oh, a lot. Same old apocalypse, new name. Insert indigenous voices here. I can't seem to find answers tonight inside my carbon offset plastic bag decision-making matrix and feeling a kind of loneliness that isn't even personal anymore. So I open an imaginary book titled The General History of Life, with its compendia of creation stories, field guides to vanquished species, cosmologies of fossil being, and a thicket of footnotes at the bottom of every page. I quickly climb inside one of them, where the center of one thought becomes the periphery of the next. I almost think I could live in here, having always felt tangential. Now it's become pretty literal, but know that I have to climb out again onto the main page where the real action happens. These having once been favorite lines by Stevens about those that returned to hear him read the poem of life, of the pans above the stove, the pots on the table, the tulips among them, those who would have wept to step barefoot into reality. And my least favorite being about the palm at the end of the mind that rises in the bronze decor, which I now see as a tree that endures while the fires burn, whose trunk I must climb down to be a 2020 US person again, to stand in my window and bang on a pan. So where did these boots and blenders come from? Why all the pictures of cats? Turns out that instead of reality, I've stepped straight into the cloud, the least cloud-like thing there is, composed as it is of people and warehouse acreage. But how relaxing and dreamlike, how familiar and strangifying to lie down under a cloud raining merchandise as the shutters close in, forming a cocoon, which turns out to be less a figure of rest than of reorganization of the organism. For instead of déjà vu, it's metamorphosis all over again. Maybe this is what Winter means by the hybrid human, as she calls for a rebalancing of biological and symbolic being, which might be an effective affective position as we emerge from the trauma of Homo economicus, an emergence I'm trying to envision in this talk or poem that I thought I'd be presenting among actual humans in an actual city before evolutionary biology changed everything. And I meandered into a flow of what is hopefully not appropriation, but engagement and gratitude. So thank you, Sylvia Wynter and Simone White, William James and Alan Locke, Jed Razula and Raymond Williams. Thank you, James Sherry and co-panelists, Bill Lavender and other organizers. And thank you always, precious poets. Thank you very much.
Kit, you need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
For those of you who weren't able to read my lips, thanks to Evelyn and Saba, thanks to Bill and James for hosting us. I'm calling this talk The Poetics of Global Cooling. Used to be there was historical time and geological time, two completely different scales, with climate changes synchronized to the latter. History was linear, progressive, as in Hegel's dialectic, while weather was cyclical, the seasons varying geographically, but not over a human lifespan. Western thought was defined in terms of nature and man, one eternal, the other historical. That was then. Climate change, born out of the marriage of colonialism and industrialization, accelerated in the 20th century to the point where we are now seeing the effects in our lifetime, and future generations are at catastrophic risk. The effects are entropic, a shift from higher to lower orders of differentiation in temperature as polar ice caps melt, coastal areas are flooded, and tropical rainforests turn to desert. These changes in our natural environment extend to changes in the environment of human society, which is to say language. We are seeing a loss of world languages, as documented by poet Bob Holman in his film Language Matters. We are treated to the spectacle of an incredible shrinking linguistics as sound bites and tweets replaced long-form reading. Such changes have the same root causes: entropic breakdown as environmental structures dissolve from difference to sameness. Authoritarian propaganda and capitalist marketing both drive style and content towards sameness, homogeneity. Poetry can stimulate resistance by emphasizing difference. How can we as poets do this? I have some suggestions. Read world poetry in translation. Try DIY translation as best you can, whether bilingual, homophonic, or collaborative. Go global. Learn about cultural contexts in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Pay attention to other art forms, music, painting, theater, dance. Collaborate with artists in different fields. Within the poem itself, try for sharp contrast at every level, word to word, line to line, stanza to stanza, poem to poem. Maximize diversity of content, diversity of style, diversity of thought, diversity of imagination. As poets, we can help each other and the world promote diversity, resist homogeneity, and combat entropy. I want to update this talk written in January 2019 with a few thoughts on COVID. The pandemic is a further instance of the collapsing distinction between nature and history. Unlike seasonal flu, which we regard as natural and cyclical, COVID is obviously a historical phenomenon. In fact, it is the historical event of our times. The pandemic was caused by some of the same forces that are driving climate change, industrial globalization, and exploitation of the biosphere. The impact of the pandemic on language makes itself felt through the intense narrowing of communication channels, the abandonment of public travel and public space in favor of email, social media, and our present environment, Zoom. I won't trip on the disastrous impact on education. We'll be digging out from that for some time to come. Meanwhile, one effect of the pandemic has had on poetry, everyone is writing poetic diaries, including me. To close, I'll read two short poems from my poetic diary of the past year, which I'm calling Quarantina. And because I feel that I still have time, I think I'll read a third one as well. The first one is called Pandemic Rhapsody. The planet as prison, each household a cell, we swim in a sea of unknowing. The planet as forest, each household a tree, we gather in the shade of many branches. The planet as ocean, each household a boat, we search for a mast on the horizon. The planet as city, each household an apartment, we sit by a window of opportunity. The planet as text, each household a sentence, we study the length of a day. The planet as dream, each household a sleeper, we fly high above vertiginous landscapes. The planet as wildfire, each household a hearth, we burn in the cauldron of our desires. The planet as war zone, each household a battalion, we must reinforce our supply lines. The planet as desert, each household an oasis, we cultivate gardens of enlightenment. The planet as mountain, each household a stream, we flow in time to the sea. And this next poem is called Premiere Etude. The mind moves as water moves, in waves, wind at their back. The mind moves as fire moves, in lines, under heavy smoke. The mind moves as earth moves, spinning through darkness and light. The mind moves as the body moves, on two legs, one step at a time. The mind moves as the planets move, elliptically, around the sun. And this last one is called 2021, Space Decameron. We are companions in the disaster. War, corruption, drought, fire, and plague. What else is new? What binds the eye to what's seen? My dream, a drink with Ron Carter. We're all astronauts now, living in a bubble with our pod mates, real and imagined, as in Tarkovsky's Solaris or Sun Ra's Rocket Number 9. Space is the place we occupy and contain in equal and opposite measure. The eye contains multitudes, solitudes crowded with loneliness. Have you had breakfast? Clean your bowl. Emptiness is the mother of all.
It's wonderful to be here with you. My talk is called Eco-Poetics of the Lowercase, Biopoetics of the Counterconduct. And my thinking here begins by acknowledging this enormous problem of our time and admits to grave doubt that we have the personal and political will to solve this problem. Yet I want to think of poetics as a means of relational thinking with sources in such works as Charles Olson's Open Field Poetics, which posits a non-dominant, non-egoic relation to what constitutes the field, self and others, biological and physical in other ways, and cognizant of place as site of both current activity and of history. It is a relationship to otherness, and that would include other peoples, other forms of life, even forms such as water or rock and what we humans have built, which we don't usually classify as life. An additional input into my own nexus of thought about climate justice and poetics of late comes from the field of biopolitics, particularly the contributions of Michel Foucault and his introduction of counterconduct as any sort of practice that would go against pastoral, governmental, or any groupthink sanctioned conduct. You might say, as Lacan, that counterconduct means having a commitment to that which fissures the otherwise seamless appearance of sense. While some might argue that any practice of poetry is by definition counter, I would differ. Poetry emerges and gains ground in the culture at large by virtue of its conformity to certain sanctions, whether those be of modernism, conceptualism, specific avant-gardisms, or any other group practice. Even eco-poetry, I think, needs to concern itself with a constant awareness and resistance to the right way of doing things, in quotes. It is by human management of resources, which includes human exploitation of resources, that we have become immersed in a seemingly inescapable mess. Inescapable because our systems of control do not seem to embrace any practices of otherness, any real challenges to business as usual. We do not need slight alterations of behavior, either as communities, nations, or individuals. We need constant alternatives, not alterations, but altering entirely. Yeats may have argued that all is changed, but our current predicament would seem to witness that not that much has changed since the early formations of capital in the beginnings of the industrial age. Olson would have us go contrary, go sing, and I concur, but I want to go back further historically to early enunciations of relationships to the natural world that both recognize that world as complexly interwoven and precariously fragile, and recognize human presence and activity as quite often alien to the non-human natural world. As James Sherry has reminded me, humanity is also nature, yet we seem to pit ourselves in contrast to all the other there, either seeing it as something to serve us or seeing us as having a relationship of dominance our Western Christian heritage once called stewardship. Even more recent practices to protect nature are framed in language of preservation and management as though the resources are something outside us, something to be controlled. I think the non-human natural world would prefer Foucault's agency of counterconduct. I think we have in our history of poetic practice models of presentation of and behavior toward the real of the natural world that are both compelling and helpful, to which we must pay attention. Do more than pay attention, because a problem with even relating poetics to ecology is that we may make artistic sense of our necessary practice without actually putting action into practice. So I want to state now, one of the limits of my own undertaking is that I'm here just pointing out some ways which I must swallow or embrace and have them inform my own actions as well as injunctions to others. I'm offering visions here, not solutions. I do not want to prescribe or proscribe anyone's behavior other than to urge that counterconduct to what has been given us so far. I also want to state that one of the reasons I'm choosing to look at a Chinese poet who flourished more than 1450 years ago and a British poet who was underappreciated even in his own time of 200 years ago, is that I believe we need to think and act locally, regionally, nationally, and globally with regard to the environment and with regard to our poetics touching on the environment. We need to address specific issues and catastrophes, but we need to do so with an envirocultural vision enriched by global and historical practices. I have been cautioned in the last year to stop traveling in planes to far places, and I fully understand the reason behind such caution, but I also think we need to talk to each other in powerful ways all across the planet and not just electronically. But, and I know this is somewhat idealistic and outmoded, not to mention pre-COVID, face-to-face, voice-to-voice, skin-to-skin. To not touch the world is part of our problem. So yes, touch that earth and touch each other across it. In the pre-Tang, the Tang dynasty held as the apex of Chinese poetry during the rule of Liang Wudi, a devout Buddhist, South China experienced a splendid and unprecedented wave of culture, religious, and literary achievement. A central salon was that of Crown Prince Xiaogong, 503 to 551, who developed an entirely new poetry named Gongche Shi, which means palace style, after its location in the Eastern Palace, not its themes, which was the official residence. This poetry was at the time something of a counter-conduct. It was denounced by Confucian moralists. It was informed by a Buddhist vision of the illusory nature of the material world and characterized by an illuminating gaze at physical reality, particularly at the lively natural environment, yet in participation with the human. And Xiaogong's Autumn Evening presents such a vibrant world, whole and sufficient. Drifting clouds emerge from the eastern peaks. In the west, the sun descends to the river. Hastening shadows stretch across and darken the walls. Lengthened rays obliquely penetrate the window. Tangled clouds glowing red are made circular by the clear water, tiny leaves outlined by a lamp in the air. A particular time of year, a time of division and transition and ambiguity. The picture is not exactly clear, rather is cloudy and outlined, going around in circles. The pouring out of the clouds depends on the mountains. The sun's descent colors the river. The clouds that cast shadows on walls. Longer rays of late afternoon go through a window. Elements mingle and circle each other in their presence upon and in the clear water. The human elements of wall, window, and lamp are merely open to what is around them, among rather than above or defining. In Mandarin, each even number line rhymes, jiang, chuang, gong, and the elements of the landscape rhyme, but it's a moving incandescent rhyme, not a closed circuit. It is the world presented in transition as well as in beauty. It's escape in which everything connects. The 19th century romantic British poet John Clare presents a somewhat more familiar ecosystem, but also makes for an interconnectivity. Even one with the human, but in which the human may be the disturbing presence. Time is short, so rushing through this a bit. In Mouse's Nest, the eye of the poem finds a ball of grass among the hay and progs it, which causes something to stir, a bird, which also makes a mouse with her young ones come out, hurrying and then again finding her nest among the hay, ending the water o'er the pebbles scarce could run, and broad old cesspools glittered in the sun. I find it a picture of an admittedly mild disturbance of a part of the natural world that may depend on human presence, the making of hay, the allowance of a place of the mouse's nest, but which is revealed as a kind of community of interwoven participants, man, bird, mouse, hay, pebbles, cesspools, and ultimately sun that are in constant interaction. The standard view of Clare, Jonathan Bate sees him this way, is that of a romantic poet projecting his own consciousness upon a picture of landscape. But E.P. Thompson differs and reads Clare as a poet who documents both the subjective and material relationship between individual and land, and also the relationship of each to the social order. He sees Clare as a poet of ecological protest, writing of a threatened equilibrium in which both the human and the non-human are involved. In his own time, compared to the sweeping romantic theories of nature and the sublime, Clare is a poet very much within his social natural spaces, attempting to represent them, but not to devalue them by putting them only at the service of human consciousness. Okay, I will end by saying, in recent days, as I've thought of extending this presentation into the present, I look at the work of the great Pacific Northwestern Japanese Canadian poet Roy Mickey, and I'll leave you with one short poem of his that might put another querulous twist on the subject. This poem is Wen, spelled W-E-N, meaning a growth on the skin or a large or overcrowded city. All instances of when in the poem are spelled this way until the last line with the only W-H-E-N. The last line of the poem contains the word wend, W-E-N-D, which here means change, but could also mean in my context today, counter-conduct. When did you make the connection between bloated bodies and bloated economies? When was the last time you checked the rear view mirror for an update on mobile identity? When promises abundance in plush surroundings? When thrives on uneven systems of growth? When is fruitful? When in season? When ogres well? When is wend? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation. I am going to talk to you about how my approaches to eco-poetics have led deeper and deeper into collaboration. And I guess when I was first starting to think about how and why this was happening, I wasn't thinking about the collaboration that I was already doing. I've been researching and working for the past few years towards a libretto about an environmental activist orca whale, J35. That research is unfortunately on hold because it requires travel to the Pacific Northwest to incorporate the voices of the people who are closest to those whales, which is an important aspect of the project. But so that's kind of on hold. I was really interested in what Kit said earlier about how everyone is writing a poetic diary, because that is not true for me. And how I've been thinking about collaboration in this time is as a means of survival. The only creative work that I have been able to develop in this period of isolation has been collaboratively. And so that that became a strategy to create work. But as I look at what's come out of that, I've been working with visual artists Nora Lovell and Lee Dygard locally. And we just had a show up at Staple Goods that just came down last week called Birding in America and Augury. That also featured LA-based video artist Nikita Gale. So I started this approach because it was the work that was possible, but in looking at what we've created together and this ongoing conversation, now we're a collective, it's gonna keep going. Birding in America and Augury is not over just because the show came down. It bears many connections to the questions of how language can address the ecological catastrophes all around us, and also how images can address that as well. So I'm gonna share my screen and show you just a few images from Birding in America and Augury, and go through a few other thoughts and read some short poems. Okay. Okay, we're there. Yes, you can see it. Yes. So Birding in America and Augury connects this in the pandemic where suddenly everyone is paying attention to birds. This is well documented. The amateur bird watching is out of control in this time. To the ancient practice of augury, of making meaningful signs about the future from birds and other animal behavior. I come to this idea with a background in classics, and the figure of Tiresias shows up quite a bit in my poems and also in the visual language of the show. Tiresias was really interesting to me in part because the story of him getting his powers includes a gender transformation. And also, like many people in the pandemic, this time of not performing socially has opened up many questions about my own gender identity. And I enjoy diving into the historical language that kind of grounds those questions. So what you're looking at right now are these augury cards, which was a collaborative element. We connected collaged language and concepts, and actually call back to Saba's talk on witch connections. The idea for the augury cards actually came through a prompt that came up in my virtual coven, which is one of the things I've been doing in the pandemic. Ask me about my virtual coven. Mostly the show is looking at non-human perspectives and including them in this moment of mutual witness where people are spending more time paying attention to birds and also noticing that the birds are paying attention to them and developing whole relationships with the outside world. Another element of the show is kind of animal celebrity on through viral internet videos about animals, which so connects with the other pandemic experience of everything being mediated by screens. So the way that we worked together was we shared an underlying conversation about all of these source materials and then created our individual work around that. So in this gallery installation view, you see the many photographs, the life-sized bird photographs by Lee Dygard, and it's hard to see the kind of binocular view images, but I'll show you close-ups later, of Nora Lovell's dense digital collages and then paintings on plaster of those same collaged images. Here's a view that shows you the Nikita Gale's extraordinary white peacock. And also those little passport-sized photos are all of the bird species that my collaborator Lee Dygard encountered in the pandemic year, and they are listed there. In terms of where my poetry comes into the collaboration, it's mostly in direct conversation with these digital collages, sharing short source material. And a lot of the source material that's coming together here traces connections between endangered and extinct species of birds and other issues, including a lot of the images feature Black birders who have become more outspoken since that incident last spring, especially the work of J. Drew Lanham in his essay Forever Gone, tracing the loss of the Carolina parakeet to the history of slavery in this country. So this image features the dodo prominently. You can also see, a tiny Tiresias here who comes up a lot, both in the poems and in the images of the show. So I'd like to read, I'm gonna read two short poems. This one shares source material with this image, which came from a viral video about a battle between an octopus and an eagle. and it's a contrapuntal, but I'll just read it one way in the interest of time. Eagle and octopus augury. Like every important story, we start in the middle, fixed firmly in the human perspective we call hero. We are the fishermen holding the stick. First, we see the bald eagle holding its breath, then the struggle at the surface. Already we've decided the story is about our world, not underwater. Before we even see the fuchsia tangle of the octopus's grip, tentacles churning, or its giant head in the shadows below. We hook one arm free, one quick jab, and the camera follows the eagle who tends to itself on a nearby rock as the color sinks out of view. Every fading empire crows out its pet war crimes, burying the others. And there's also a heron and eel augury about this story of a heron who swallowed an eel that then punched right through that heron's stomach, which I encourage you to look up. This is Nora's image about the Carolina parakeet that also features J. Drew Lanham, who I mentioned earlier. This is in conversation with the last poem that I'll read from this series, which was the most collaborative. I was working with Lee Dygard to compile video clips of what parrots and parakeets and even ravens say on the internet when they are recorded by their owners. Looking for poetic language, ideally. What we found in searching through these sound bites from the mouths of parrots was that although I could find a lot of poetic parrots in other languages, memorizing whole texts and repeating them, in American English, the parrots were mostly talking about the police. This is an example of how by looking at birds, we found that we were able to, that this work kind of touched everything, that led in all directions, exploring the issues of the present moment. So this poem it begins with just found language from YouTube parrots, and then I start to play with it. YouTube parrot augury. What seems to be the problem, officer? Don't touch me. I know what's the matter. Nobody expects a green and yellow bird that talks, pretty girl. It's not easy being green. I'm a jailbird. I am not a crook. I fly like an eagle. That would surely be absurd. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, but that's not important right now. Siren sound. What seems to be the poem, officer? Nobody expects a green and yellow word. I am not a book. It's not easy being seen. Don't touch me. Kissing sounds. Wolf whistle. Nobody expects the Spanish flu. That would surely be abroad. I know what's the matter, but that's not important right now. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm in Canarsie, unceded Canarsie land, with a wild mouse, a virtual wild mouse. Thank you, James, for bringing us all together. It's been so generative and inspirational to hear everyone talk. I'm going to read a little bit from an essay that I wrote for the Georgia Review, which breaks down the multi-meanings of human. It's called Who We Are as Floral, Faunal, Mineral Beings. Can you hear me okay? Okay. The conceptual basis of the human looms over the horizon of presence, dominating the conditions of being. My preoccupation has been to imagine this term dissolving, encouraging human persons to be drawn into the social, cultural, and material collective of floral, faunal, and mineral consciousness in ways that have been stymied and flatly denied. Once this taxiomatic membrane has been collapsed, humans have a chance to meld with animacy and regain a connection with the world. It can be startling to remind humans of our animal identity as Homo sapiens, essentially apes. Humans share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. The genetic similarity between a cat and a human is 90%, humans and mice 85%. In fact, we are trans species. Our bodies are populated by microbiota, living floral entities, to the degree that autonomous life isn't possible without mutual cohabitation within and across bodies of each other. According to a recent National Institute of Health estimate, 90% of cells in the human body are bacterial, fungal, or otherwise non-human. The smallest organism changes the world infinitely. Our bodies are composites of plant, animal, and mineral memory and impulse. Humans are continually fortified by plant, animal, and mineral nourishment ingested and integrated into our bodies to form our cellular structures. All living persons of the world share similar DNA. Bona fide human genes account only for less than 1% of the whole genetic information we carry with us. A human individual is a holobiont. I don't know if I say that right. An assembly of life forms coexisting together as a multiple and as one, the person with a name that absorbs the unnamed members of their mutual body. A holobiont is an organism plus its persistent communities of symbionts. The person that is a multiple is continually in flux, changing within environmental conditions that are also always transforming. The human body has numerous holes, apertures, and openings where life flows within and through. The body is synthetic of its interaction and response with nature, cell with cell, viscous, mineral. Organisms are porous, permeable. Everyone drags the world with them, and the world drags everyone along. We touch something and it touches back. What we touch may be alive, electrically charged, replete with meaning. The exchange happens on the micro and macro level. Rethinking how it is that we are actually many beings moving through time and space together, collectively responding to our environment, changes how we negotiate personhood together. I must be understood as polyphonous, dissident, cooperative, multi-possessing. This means the voices in our heads are real voices, and voices don't only emanate from the top of our body. Our entire body is signaling and vocalizing via energy exchange. The voices are myriad. The interplay between living entities within bodies creates an embodied consciousness that animates pathways of intuition, mental telepathy, erotic connection, clairvoyance, the ability to navigate the unfamiliar and seemingly ordinary and central psychic territory. Our gestures of expression are thus polyvocal, polyvalent. Personhoods that exude complex inter-organization are a norm, not an exception. Anne Pringle, a mycologist at Harvard University's Department of Evolutionary Biology, studies the interdependence involving lichens and other beings. Quote, what was once thought to be a mutualism involving two species may be an entangled symbiosis of thousands of species interacting in every conceivable fashion. A lichen is not just a fungus and its photosynthetic algae. Lichens house hundreds, thousands, or perhaps tens of thousands of other species within the thallus, including other kinds of fungi and myriad bacteria. Unquote. Another example of the dynamic interplay of bodies is a slime mold. According to the Paris Zoological Park that is exhibiting them, this slime mold has 720 sexes and can heal itself. The mold is able to subdivide into different organisms and then fuse back together. The microscopic members of society are busy correlating with macro members and vice versa. An I is already a society of presences, communing amongst and together as one and also as divisible. In an insular move, predominantly Western, i.e. European and North American, human, floral, mineral animals have designated human as an exclusive category, listing features such as opposable thumbs, complex language, emotion, and tool usage as distinguishing characteristics. Over time, these claims of difference have collapsed, proved to be incorrect. Every living being responds holistically to the terms of their engagements with the world. Particular environmental niches require different skills and abilities, ways of moving in the world, ways of expressing. We are shaped by the world as we shape the world. It is a dubious practice to measure intelligence on a sliding hierarchical scale in comparison with humans as a supposed apex species. Human existence is alienated from belonging contextually to earthly life. The human sphere can feel like a self-contained bubble that refuses the embrace of the intricacies of a shared world. Other beings are held at a periphery of human consciousness, on the outskirts, the margins, in a world that happens to be the same world cohabited with humans. The majority of human policies and decisions don't consider other animal, plant, and mineral reality in the decision-making processes, except as use value. The effects of this blind spot, this ignorance, this lapse in collective negotiation has been a disaster for all sentient life. Life is an interrelational exchange, a cacophonous experience of sensory engagement. The lived body, lived mind, and lived environment are all thus a part of the same process, the process by which one enacts one's world. Earthly life is interwoven, co-constituent, mutual repetition. A holistic phenomenology motivates a fully saturated ontology. Materially, consequences reverberate through the flesh and fiber of existence. The species divide is punitive. To be deemed human, understood historically by Western white heteropatriarchy, instilled and buttressed by capitalism, is what has constituted personhood. To be human was understood on a scale of more or less human, the subhuman, beastly, equated with wild animals, degenerate life. The logic is racist, eugenic, and extractivist. The divisiveness of the category human is the major feature and tool of a symbolic and cultural hegemony of power and control. The history of man in tandem with the system of exploitation, capitalism, are social inventions of the European Enlightenment period that continue to haunt human, animal, floral, and mineral, biological, social, and cultural relations. Enmeshed in the logic of hierarchical violence along race, gender, class, and species division, who we can refer to as person is restricted, dormant, impossibility, punitively meted out, barely realized. The inability to regard others as persons is a direct result of this legacy thinking that qualifies only hetero white male property owning Christians as true individuals. The category or categories human is thus a complicated invention of domination, subjugation, and complicity. And I could go on and on because it's a long essay, but I don't want to overwhelm this forum. I just want to stop for a second again, to thank James Sherry for publishing this book, Bionic Communality, where these themes are developed in a more poetic genre and read just like a micro section. And the light is fading in my room. As you can tell, I'm becoming blurry. I'm always blurry. Every day a new beginning. Re-enter the language in action. Heads turn to the visitor. They have been arranged to die in the ward. Jostle expectancy. Wilted floral presences rejuvenate when singing begins. What they know will disappear forever, taking with them cellular archives. Admonitions as chimes sound alarm. Gently sponging, gently combing, being mindful of feeling. Glide over skin membrane of consciousness. Tomorrow is eternity in incremental installments. For now, an everlasting momentary suspension. Real-time motivation, cellular connectivity. Carefully bathing and attending, being here wholly in a space of dying and becoming. Adjusting sweatpants to comfort creature familiarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. That was wonderful. And thank you all for coming today. If we have time, I'd like to open it up to any questions from the audience. If you have a question, maybe you could raise your hand. I think there's a hand raising reaction that's possible.
You can do that, or you can do this, or you can type it in the chat.
So the first question comes from Los Glazer. Question for anybody. Given the richness of all your presentations, particularly in detailing the diversity that language can foster through poetry, ecopoetics, and theory, is there a sense of when ecopoetics activates, that is, rips the corporate economic straitjacket? Is there any hope, given the totalizing economic order, for language to aid the environment? So that's a pretty heavy question, Loss.
Well, you want a question.
Yeah,
it's kind of the
gave it
issue,
to
you
us.
know. I mean, I want to get out of this, you know. I mean, you know, we all have the same goal, and I'm just like, I guess, impatient, or I don't know, but
Well,
I mean,
it sounds like
what are steps?
It sounds overwhelming because you're approaching it at a very high level of scale. So my response would be that you have to start somewhere, and where we're starting here is that we're appearing to one another and speaking to one another. So, and that's a kind of language activity in which minds are changed or opened or re-swizzled. And, you know, we're doing what we can. And I think it's fair to have some faith that this kind of communication results in other communications and other thoughts, and things spread outward. So rather than thinking about it from the top down, I tend to think about it from the bottom up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think also language and poetics is not alone in this battle. And so many of these presentations have been about things being mixed together, whether it's, you know, Brenda's the human and all of the other species that help to constitute it, or Kit's sense of how we have to go global and translate and mix things up even more. And I think, of course, the work of poetics and the work of poetry has to be with many other partners in this world. And then maybe it can do something. I don't want to go back to that place. What, poetry makes nothing happen? I don't believe that.
So any other responses from the panel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That Elizabeth, do you want to go first, or I can go with whatever you prefer? I didn't mean to talk over you. Okay, I'll just go and then you can go. So I have a feeling we have some interesting overlaps between our conversations about augury and about ideas of digital covens. And I think especially during the pandemic, this notion of the coven or the collective groups of women or people aligned with women's issues and ideas has really raised this sort of question of our relationship to the environment, to the garden, to nature, to what nature is, to personhood, to collaborative connections between people that I do think challenge structurally, theoretically, personally, these notions of like corporate ambition and things like that. I don't know how much these things are particularly going to directly attack, the policies that cause problems with the environment, that enforce and reify these problems. But I do think that this notion of collective activism that is becoming a lot more personal, that is demanding immediate and personal engagement, is meaningful. And I think the more that we can connect naturally with the sense of what is possible and connect power to this idea of collective connection, there is more of a chance that this language can become useful in organizing efforts to improve stewardship of the planet. So.
Great.
Yep.
Elizabeth?
So I just wanted to add what I think that poetry can do is shift perspectives and also, yeah, I want to echo what Saba's saying. This time has shifted our relationships. I don't want to be I feel, don't mistake me for a pandemic optimist, but the world changed a lot. And now we know that it can change. And I feel like the idea that the world can't change and that capitalism is unstoppable and that patriarchy is unstoppable is a really powerful obstacle to activism and change. So even though the world has changed in a terrible way, people have found lots of ways to connect despite that. And the circumstances of people's connection and collaboration with each other are not the same circumstances that built the world that we had before. So I do find some hope and power in that shift, and both through the way that language culture is changing and in poetics and through the various technological tools that we have to share aspects of our lives with each other through the internet.
I have a slightly different way I think about these things, in that, but just one thing, I think we always have to remember that Auden said poetry makes nothing happen, and then a few lines later he says it's a way of happening. So, and I think it is a way of happening, and all these issues of language are incredibly important and have meaning, and all we have to look at is the phrase Black Lives Matter, which is in a way is a piece of poetry, and an ambiguous one even, and see how much that engages people. But I think, just as someone who's written a lot of environmental poetry for a long time, I came to a point where I couldn't just talk about how that matters. We have a time clock going on climate, and I just think we also have to do politics, because that is where effective public change happens. And I think language can contribute to that. But the truth is we have about 7 years and before irrevocable, change happens. And I just think the culture changes things in the way it does and the time frame it does. And that's really, really important and totally necessary. But this particular dialogue, I think we have to also work as citizens in different modes at the same time. But that's just my journey. And it's a liberating journey, because actually for the poet, you go there, it also lets you explore what poetry can do without always being up against that wall of how much can it make happen. So in some ways it's very freeing. So that's how I think about it.
Thank you, Evelyn. A question has actually came from the panel. Brenda was wondering, Evelyn, when you're talking about effective shifts around consciousness of ecological issues, are there other effective shifts that you are thinking of and feeling that we're experiencing?
Well, I don't want to take up too much more of the time on this, but just thanks, Brenda. And just one thing I noticed when the environmental movement morphed into the climate movement is it had a very different language, by the way, way more diversity of participation, and was welcoming to like indigenous peoples and religious people. It wasn't just the language of science statistics, and it grew. And so you have this whole youth movement. That's a political answer, but I think it has everything to do with the affective also.
The other thing that that's happened that we didn't bring into this discussion, Bill Lavender points out that that there was another Poetics of Climate Change panel, and we have that link in the chat. Bill, can you say something about how you see these two panels linking together? Well, maybe Bill's not around.
Muted.
He's muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. No, it's really interesting the way the two panels, I mean, they could have just flowed seamlessly together. Very different, yet different points of view, yet very similar sorts of melding of poetics and how can I call it? It's not exactly ecological activism, is it? It's also the politics of climate change, and you know, it's really the politics of survival, in which all of these things, you know, language, effective response, counterconduct, all these things are involved in it. And, you know, I do think that poetics is one of the ways that it can be approached broadly. Like, it's truly not possible to approach the problem holistically from the point of view of politics, nor from the point of view of economics, you know. But from the standpoint of language, you can actually, you know, maybe approach the complexity of the problem and how it how best to act in it. Yeah, I don't know, just my 2 cents.
Yeah, well, being in New Orleans, you guys, almost more than anyone in the country, have a real firsthand experience of what climate change is starting to mean, that will eventually mean that for everyone. And so
Yeah,
you know,
Good.
Elizabeth, you were writing about this a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that was what I was going to talk about if this had happened last year, was what is to be, what's interesting to notice, and what is possible in poetics by holding a post-apocalyptic perspective. But in some ways, I feel like the pandemic does that too. I mean, like we have something really global now that is not actually separable from environmental causes. I mean, it has to do with habitat destruction that these diseases cross from animal to human life. And even if people aren't tracking that exactly, it's there. Yeah, I sometimes find I lose my place in conversations about ecological catastrophe that located in the future. because it's already happening a lot of places, and it's happened here. But that also, I feel like it does something. Like the world ends and the world ends and the world ends, moving through that provides some, just a different perspective that I think lends something to the conversation when we're talking about what's coming and what's coming, to also look at what's already here and what's already happened.
Well, this is we've run an hour and a half, and I think this is just the beginning, and I really appreciated what everyone has done, but maybe that's enough for now. And I hope that we'll be able to do this. I'd like to do this again, Bill, next year when we're all live, so that we continually get to update our points of view. But for now, maybe that's enough. Are there any final comments that people would like to make? Bill, thank you so much for letting us have this time.
Well, thank all of you. I thought it was a great panel, and I thought it was a harbinger of the future. You know, I think that poetics and ecology are going to have to address each other more and more, and you know, so really glad to have all of you here, and yeah, let's do it again next year and see where it goes then. So
Looking forward to that. New Orleans next year.
all right.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Bill.
Bye, bye.
Thanks, James.